Chapter 1. The Invitation to Whispering Woods. The envelope arrived on a dreary Tuesday morning, its edges slightly frayed, as though it had travelled a great distance. Hercule Poirot, seated at her impeccably organised desk, eyed it with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The handwriting was elegant yet hurried, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. She slit the envelope open with her silver letter-opener, a gift from a grateful client, and unfolded the single sheet of parchment inside. The letter was brief, but its contents were anything but ordinary. Dear Mademoiselle Poirot, I find myself in need of your unique talents. A matter of great urgency has arisen here in Whispering Woods, a place where the shadows seem to whisper secrets of their own. I dare not say more in writing, but I implore you to come at once. Your presence may be the only thing that can prevent a tragedy. Yours in desperation. Eleanor Blackwood Poirot's eyebrows arched slightly. Eleanor Blackwood, a name she had not heard in years. They had crossed paths briefly during the war, when Eleanor had been a nurse tending to the wounded. What could have driven her to such a state of distress? And what, Poirot wondered, were these whispering shadows? She rose from her desk and moved to the window, her fingers tapping lightly against the glass. Outside, the London streets bustled with their usual chaos, but her mind was already far away, in a secluded village she had never heard of. Whispering Woods. The name alone was enough to pique her interest. Ah, but of course, she murmured to herself, her voice soft but decisive. The little grey cells, they demand it. One must investigate. By midday, Poirot had packed her belongings and arranged for a car to take her to the train station. As the city faded into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and dense forests, she found herself pondering the nature of the mystery that awaited her. A whispered legend, a plea for help, a tragedy waiting to unfold. The train rattled on, and Poirot closed her eyes, her mind already weaving through the possibilities. Whatever lay ahead in Whispering Woods, one thing was certain. Hercule Poirot would not rest until the truth was uncovered. Chapter 2. The Legend of the Woods. The train pulled into the small station at dusk, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. Hercule Poirot stepped onto the platform, her sharp eyes taking in the quaint yet sombre surroundings. The village of Whispering Woods was as still as a painting, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves carried by the wind. A man in a worn, tweed jacket approached her, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. "Mademoiselle Poirot?" he asked, his voice tinged with relief. "I'm Thomas, the driver from Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Blackwood sent me to fetch you." Poirot nodded, her gaze lingering on the dense forest that loomed beyond the village. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches twisted and gnarled like the fingers of some ancient creature. "Whispering Woods," she murmured. Curious name, no?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting toward the forest. "Aye, it's an old place with an older story. Best not to speak of it too loudly, though. Some say the woods—" "Listen." Poirot's eyes sparkled with interest. "And what do they hear, these woods of yours?" The driver shifted uncomfortably. "Legends mostly, folk tales, but there's one that stood the test of time. They say the woods whisper to those who listen closely, Warnings, secrets, even prophecies. But the ones who hear them, well, they don't always come back the same. Poirot tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Fascinating. And do you believe these tales, Monsieur Thomas? He gave a nervous laugh. I've lived here all my life, ma'am. I've seen things I can't explain. Best to keep your wits about you in these parts. The car ride to Blackwood Manor was quiet, the road winding through the heart of the forest. The trees pressed in on either side, their shadows long and menacing in the fading light. Poirot observed the landscape with a detective's eye, noting the peculiar stillness, the absence of birdsong, the way the air seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible tension. As they approached the manor, a grand but foreboding structure of grey stone, Poirot's thoughts returned to the legend, whispers in the woods, warnings, secrets. It was the kind of mystery that appealed to her sense of order and logic. After all, every legend had its roots in truth. It was simply a matter of uncovering it. The car came to a halt, and Thomas opened the door for her. "Here we are, ma'am. Mrs. Blackwood's waiting for you inside." Poirot stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning the manor's facade. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, but the overall impression was one of isolation, as though the house itself were holding its breath. As she approached the door, a faint sound reached her ears, a low, almost imperceptible murmur, like the rustle of leaves or the distant echo of a voice. She paused, her head tilting slightly. Was it the wind? Or something else? The door creaked, open, revealing Eleanor Blackwood, her face pale and drawn. "Mademoiselle Poirot," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "Thank God you've come. I fear we are all in grave danger." Poirot stepped inside, her mind already racing. The legend of the woods, the whispers, the air of unease, it was all connected, and she intended to find out how. Chapter 3. A Gathering of Strangers. The grand hall of Blackwood Manor was dimly lit, the flickering light of the chandelier casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Hercule Poirot stood just inside the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her. The room was filled with an air of tension, the kind that clung to the edges of polite conversation and forced smiles. Eleanor Blackwood led her further inside, her voice low and urgent. "Let me introduce you to the others. They've all been affected by what's happening here." Poirot nodded, her gaze already assessing the small group gathered near the fireplace. There were 5 of them, each distinct in appearance and demeanour, yet united by an undercurrent of unease. "This is Dr. Jonathan Hartley," Eleanor began, gesturing to a tall, broad-shouldered man with greying hair and a stern expression. He nodded curtly at Poirot, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "He's been our family physician for years." "A pleasure," Poirot said, though she noted the faint tremor in his voice as he replied. Next was a young woman with fiery red hair and a defiant tilt to her chin. "This is Miss Clara Winslow," Eleanor continued. "She's a journalist, here to write about the legend of the woods." Clara offered a tight smile. "I didn't expect to find myself part of the story," she said, her tone laced with irony. Beside her stood a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Harold Grayson," Eleanor said. "He's a historian, specializing in local folklore." Charmed, Grayson murmured, though his eyes darted toward the windows as if expecting something or someone to appear. The fourth guest was a striking woman in her 40s, her elegant dress and poised demeanour suggesting wealth and influence. Lady Margaret Thornbury, Eleanor introduced, an old friend of the family. Lady Thornbury inclined her head gracefully. Mademoiselle Poirot, she said, her voice smooth but with a hint of steel, I've heard much about your talents. And I of you, Poirot replied, though she had not. The woman's gaze was calculating, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Finally, there was a young man leaning against the mantel, his arms crossed and his expression sullen. And this is Mr. Samuel Reed, Eleanor said. He's been staying with us for a few weeks now. Samuel gave a non-committal grunt, his eyes fixed on the fire. Poirot noted the tension in his posture, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against his arm. Eleanor turned to Poirot, her face pale but resolute. As you can see, we are a diverse group, but we all share one thing in common. We've heard the whispers. Poirot's eyebrows rose. All of you? Eleanor nodded. It started a week ago. At first, it was just faint murmurs, like the wind through the trees. But then, the voices became clearer. They spoke of danger, of death, and then the accidents began. Accidents? Poirot asked, her voice calm but probing. A falling chandelier, Clara interjected, her tone sharp. A fire in the library. And yesterday, a set of stairs collapsed just as Mr. Grayson was about to descend them. Grayson shuddered visibly. If I hadn't stopped to tie my shoe... Coincidence? Poirot mused aloud, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. That's what we thought at first, Eleanor said. But then Samuel saw something in the woods. All eyes turned to Samuel, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. It was just a shadow, he muttered, but it moved wrong, like it wasn't human. A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Poirot's gaze swept over the group, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. A doctor, a journalist, a historian, a socialite, and a brooding young man, each with their own secrets, their own reasons for being here, and now bound together by a shared fear. Tell me, Poirot said at last, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. What do these whispers say? Eleanor's hands trembled as she clasped them together. They say, beware the echo, it always returns. Chapter 4. The first whisper dinner that evening was a tense affair. The long mahogany table was set with fine china and silverware, but the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The guests picked at their food, their conversation stilted and forced. Even the crackling fire in the hearth did little to dispel the chill that seemed to permeate the room. Hercule Poirot, seated at the head of the table, observed the group with her usual precision. Dr. Hartley's jaw was clenched as he sipped his wine, his eyes darting toward the windows. Clara Winslow scribbled notes in a small journal, her pen scratching furiously against the paper. Harold Grayson fidgeted with his napkin, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Lady Thornbury maintained her composure, though her fingers tapped rhythmically against the tablecloth. Samuel Reed, seated at the far end, stared into his plate, his expression unreadable. Eleanor Blackwood, seated beside Poirot, leaned in and whispered, "They're all on edge. The whispers. They've been getting louder." Poirot nodded, her sharp eyes catching the subtle signs of unease. "And when do these whispers occur?" "At night," Eleanor replied, her voice barely audible, "when the woods are at their darkest." As if on cue, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, causing several guests to startle. Clara's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. "Blast it," she muttered, retrieving it with a shaky hand. Poirot's gaze shifted to the windows, where the shadows of the trees swayed ominously. "Tell me, Madame Blackwood," she said, her tone calm but probing, "have any of the guests ventured into the woods since these whispers began?" Eleanor hesitated. "Only Samuel. He claims to have seen something out there." Samuel's head snapped up at the mention of his name, his eyes narrowing. I didn't imagine it," he said defensively. "It was real." "What did you see, Monsieur Reed?" Poirot asked, her voice steady. Samuel hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the others. "A figure," he said at last, "tall, with no face, just shadows." A silence fell over the table, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Then faintly, a sound reached their ears, a low, murmuring whisper, like the rustle of leaves or the distant echo of a voice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clara froze, her pen hovering above her journal. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though the words remained just out of reach. Dr. Hartley pushed back his chair, his face pale. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lady Thornbury rose, gracefully, her composure unshaken. "Surely there's a rational explanation. The wind, perhaps, or an animal in the woods." But even as she spoke, the whispers intensified, forming a single chilling phrase. "Beware the echo." Harold Grayson let out a strangled gasp, his spectacles slipping from his nose. "It's real," he whispered. "It's real." Poirot stood, her expression calm but alert. Remain calm, mes amis," she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "We must not let fear cloud our judgment." Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the group, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "Someone light a candle!" Clara exclaimed, her voice trembling. A moment later, the fire flared, casting the room in a dim, flickering light. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the frightened faces of the guests. But one face was missing. "Where is Samuel?" she asked, her voice sharp. The group turned toward his seat, now empty. The window beside it was slightly ajar, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. "He's gone," Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Poirot moved swiftly to the window, her keen eyes scanning the darkness outside. The woods loomed like a wall of shadows, their whispers now a deafening roar. Somewhere in the distance a faint light flickered. A lantern, perhaps, or something else entirely. "We must find him," Poirot said, her tone brooking no argument. "But we must not act rashly. The woods are not to be trifled with." The group gathered their coats and lanterns. Poirot's mind raced. The whispers, the figure Samuel had seen, the chilling phrase, "Beware the echo!" It was all connected. But how? And what or who was behind it? The hunt was on. Chapter 5. The disappearance. The group assembled at the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting flickering pools of light on the ground. The trees loomed before them, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. The whispers had subsided, but the air was thick with tension, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Hercule Poirot stood at the forefront, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "We must stay together," she said firmly. "The woods are vast, and it would be all too easy to become lost." Dr. Hartley adjusted his lantern, his face pale but determined. "Do you really think he went in there? It's madness." "Madness or not," Clara Winslow interjected, her voice tight with anxiety, "we can't just leave him out there." Lady Thornbury, ever composed, adjusted her gloves. "Let us not waste time debating. If the young man is in danger, we must act swiftly." Harold Grayson, clutching his lantern with trembling hands, muttered, "The woods! They're not safe. Not at night." Poirot turned to him, her gaze piercing. "What do you mean, Monsieur Grayson?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the trees. "There are stories of people who went into the woods and never returned. Or if they did, they were changed." A shiver ran through the group, but Poirot remained calm. "Stories are often rooted in truth," she said, "but we must not let fear dictate our actions. Let us proceed." They ventured into the woods, the lanterns casting eerie shadows on the trees. The ground was soft beneath their feet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The only sound was the crunch of twigs underfoot and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After a few minutes of walking, Clara stopped abruptly, her lantern held high. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Footprints!" Poirot knelt to examine the ground. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp. "They lead deeper into the woods," she observed. "This way." They followed the trail, the trees growing denser and the shadows darker. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. "Beware the echo," they seemed to say, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. Dr. Hartley clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "This is impossible," muttered. "It's just the wind." But even as he spoke, a figure appeared in the distance, a tall, shadowy silhouette standing motionless among the trees. The group froze, their lanterns trembling in their hands. "Samuel?" Clara called out, her voice shaking. The figure did not respond. Instead, it turned and began to move away, its movements unnaturally smooth. "Wait!" Poirot called, her voice sharp and commanding. But the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the woods. The group hurried after it, their lanterns bobbing wildly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to come from all directions at once. "Beware the echo, it always returns." Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath Harold Grayson, and he let out a cry as he stumbled into a shallow ditch. The others rushed to his aid, pulling him to his feet. "Are you hurt?" Poirot asked, her tone brisk but concerned. Grayson shook, his head, though his face was pale, and his hands trembled. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. As they pressed on, the woods seemed to close in around them, the trees forming a labyrinth of shadows. The whispers grew, louder, more frantic, until they reached a small clearing. In the centre stood Samuel Reed, his back to them, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "Samuel!" Clara called, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God we found you!" But as they approached, Samuel turned to face them, and the group recoiled in horror. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his face pale as death, and from his lips came a voice that was not his own, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down their spines. The echo returns. Before anyone could react, Samuel collapsed to the ground, his body limp. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind through the trees. Poirot knelt beside him, her fingers pressing against his wrist. "He is alive," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "But we must get him back to the manor at once." As the group lifted Samuel and began the trek back, Poirot's mind raced. The whispers, the figure in the woods, Samuel's strange behaviour, it was all connected. But what was the echo, and why did it seem to be targeting them? The mystery was deepening, and Poirot knew that time was running out. Chapter 6. The Hidden. History back at Blackwood Manor. Samuel Reed was laid on a sofa in the drawing-room, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Hartley examined him, his brow furrowed in concern. "He's in shock," he said, "but there's no physical injury. Whatever happened out there, it's taken a toll on his mind." The group gathered around, their faces pale and drawn. Clara Winslow paced the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What did he mean by 'the echo returns'?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "And who or what was that figure in the woods?" Poirot, seated in a high-backed chair, steepled her fingers thoughtfully. "To answer these questions," she said, "we must look to the past. Madam Blackwood, you mentioned a tragedy tied to the woods. Will you tell us more?" Eleanor Blackwood hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's not a story I like to tell," she said softly, "but perhaps it's time." She took a deep breath and began. 50 years ago, my great-aunt, Lady Constance Blackwood, lived in this manor. She was a kind woman, beloved by the village, but she had a secret, a forbidden love affair with a man from the woods, a traveller who was said to have strange powers. When the village discovered their relationship, they turned on her. They accused her of consorting with evil and drove her, lover, away. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what became of Lady Constance?" Eleanor's voice trembled. "She was found dead in the woods, her body lying at the base of an ancient tree. The villagers claimed it was suicide, but my family always believed. She was murdered. Her lover vanished without a trace, but before he left, he cursed the woods. He said the trees would remember her pain, and that one day the echo of her death would return." A heavy silence fell over the room. Harold Grayson, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "The echo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what the whispers are. The echo of her death." Poirot nodded, her expression thoughtful, and the figure Samuel saw. Could it be the spirit of Lady Constance, or perhaps her lover? Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know. but the legend says that when the echo returns, it brings with it a reckoning. Those who hear the whispers are marked for death." Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Marked for death? That's ridiculous. There has to be a logical explanation." "Perhaps," Poirot said, her tone calm but firm. "But logic and legend are not always mutually exclusive. The key lies in understanding how the past connects to the present." She turned to Harold Grayson. "Monsieur Grayson, as a historian, you must have researched the woods extensively. Is there anything in your studies that could shed light on this?" Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. "There are records of strange occurrences in the woods over the years. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, but nothing as tangible as this. However, there is one thing." He hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. "The tree where Lady Constance was found. It's still standing. It's said to be the heart of the woods, the source of the whispers." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Then that is where we must go." Eleanor's face paled. "No one who has gone to that tree has ever returned." "Then it is fortunate," Poirot said, rising to her feet, "that I am not just anyone." Chapter 7. The Second Whisper. The group gathered in the drawing-room, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace. Hercule Poirot stood at the centre, her presence commanding attention. "We must act quickly," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The tree at the heart of the woods is the key to this mystery, but we must proceed with caution." Clara Winslow crossed her arms, her expression sceptical. "You're seriously suggesting we go back out there, after what happened to Samuel?" "Precisely because of what happened to Samuel," Poirot replied. "The answers we seek lie in the woods, and time is of the essence." Dr. Hartley frowned, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This is madness. We're not equipped to deal with whatever is out there." Lady Thornbury, ever composed, adjusted her gloves. "If Mademoiselle Poirot believes this is the only way, then I suggest we follow her lead. Hesitation will only cost us more." Harold Grayson, still shaken from their earlier encounter, nodded reluctantly. "The tree is about a mile into the woods. I can guide us there, but I can't guarantee what we'll find." Poirot's gaze swept over the group. "We will stay together. No one ventures off alone. Understood?" The group murmured their agreement, though the tension in the room was palpable. As they prepared to leave, Samuel Reed stirred on the sofa, his eyes fluttering open. "Wait!" he croaked, his voice weak but urgent. "You can't go." Poirot moved to his side, her expression softening. "Monsieur Reed, you must rest. We will handle this." Samuel shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. The echo, it's not just a warning. It's a trap. It wants you to go deeper." Poirot's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Before Samuel could respond, a faint sound reached their ears. A low, murmuring whisper, like the rustle of leaves or the distant echo of a voice. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the windows. "Not again!" Clara muttered, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they formed a single chilling phrase. "The echo returns." Dr. Hartley clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "This is impossible. It's just the wind." But even as he spoke, the room grew colder, the fire in the hearth flickering and dying. The whispers intensified, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Beware the echo. It always returns." Lady Thornbury's composure faltered, her hand flying to her chest. "What is happening?" Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, her mind racing. "Stay calm," she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "This is a distraction. We must not let it unsettle us." Suddenly, the window shattered, sending shards of glass cascading to the floor. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the last of the fire. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices echoing in the darkness. "We need to leave," Harold Grayson said, his voice shaking. "Now!" The group hurried out of the drawing room, their lanterns casting flickering pools of light on the walls. As they reached the front door, Poirot paused, her gaze lingering on the shattered window. "This is no mere legend," she murmured. "There is intelligence behind this, a mind at work." Clara gripped her lantern tightly, her face pale. "You think someone's doing this on purpose?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, her tone thoughtful. "Or perhaps the woods themselves are alive in a way we cannot yet comprehend." As they stepped outside, the whispers subsided, leaving only the sound of the wind through the trees. The woods loomed before them, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Poirot turned to the group, her expression resolute. "We will find the tree. We will uncover the truth, and we will put an end to this." The group nodded, their fear tempered by determination. But as they ventured into the woods, the whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. "Beware the echo. It always returns." Chapter 8. A Trail of Clues. The woods were darker than before, the trees pressing in on all sides like silent sentinels. The group moved cautiously, their lanterns casting flickering light on the uneven ground. The whispers had subsided, but the air was thick with tension, as if the woods themselves were watching. Hercule Poirot led the way, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Harold Grayson followed close behind, his lantern trembling in his hand. "The tree should be just ahead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we must be careful. The ground here is treacherous." Clara Winslow, walking beside Dr. Hartley, glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The group paused, listening. At first there was only the sound of the wind through the trees. Then faintly, a low, rhythmic tapping reached their ears, like the sound of a branch knocking against a window. "It's just the wind," Dr. Hartley said, though his voice lacked conviction. Poirot's gaze narrowed. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is a sign." They pressed on, the tapping growing louder as they approached a small clearing. In the centre stood an ancient tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air around it was unnaturally still, the whispers silent for the first time since they had entered the woods. "This is it," Harold Grayson said, his voice trembling. "The heart of the woods." Poirot stepped forward, her lantern held high. The tree's bark was rough and weathered, But as she examined it more closely, she noticed something unusual. A series of symbols carved into the wood, their edges worn smooth by time. "What are those?" Clara asked, her curiosity momentarily overcoming her fear. Poirot traced the symbols with her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They appear to be runes," she said, "an ancient form of writing. Monsieur Grayson, do you recognize them?" Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the carvings. "They're protection symbols," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Meant to ward off evil. But there's something else." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "This one here, it's a name. Constance." Eleanor Blackwood gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "My great-aunt," she whispered. "She must have carved this before she died." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "A final message, perhaps. But what does it mean?" As she spoke, a faint sound reached their ears, a low, murmuring whisper, like the rustle of leaves or the distant echo of a voice. The group froze, their lanterns trembling in their hands. "Not again!" Clara muttered, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they formed a single chilling phrase. "The echo returns." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the tree's roots shifting and groaning as if awakening from a long slumber. The group stumbled back, their lanterns casting wild shadows on the trees. "What's happening?" Dr. Hartley exclaimed, his voice filled with panic. Poirot remained calm, her sharp eyes scanning the clearing. "The tree," she said, her voice steady. "It's reacting to our presence." As the tremors subsided, a faint light began to emanate from the tree's trunk, illuminating the runes with an eerie glow. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Beware the echo, it always returns." Poirot stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the tree. "There is something here," she said, "something hidden." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the bark. As she did, a small compartment in the trunk slid open, revealing a tattered journal. The cover was worn and faded, but the name on the front was still legible: Constance Blackwood. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp. "Her journal," she whispered. "We found it." Poirot carefully retrieved the journal, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. "This may hold the key to the mystery," she said, "but we must not linger here. The woods are not safe." As the group turned to leave, the whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. "Beware the echo, it always returns." Chapter 9. The Confrontation in the Woods. The group hurried away from the ancient tree, the whispers growing louder and more insistent with each step. The journal clutched in Hercule Poirot's hands felt heavy with secrets, but there was no time to examine it. Not yet. The woods seemed alive, the trees swaying unnaturally, as if trying to block their path. "We need to get back to the manor," Clara Winslow said, her voice tight with fear. "This place, it's not safe." "Agreed," Dr. Hartley said, his face pale. "But which way is out?" The lanterns cast flickering light on the dense undergrowth, but the path they had taken seemed to have vanished. The trees loomed closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. Beware the echo! It always returns. Poirot stopped abruptly, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Wait, she said, her voice calm but firm. We are being led. Led? Harold Grayson asked, his voice trembling. By what? By whatever, or whoever, is behind this, Poirot replied. The whispers, the tree, the journal. It is all connected, and it wants us to follow. Lady Thornbury adjusted her gloves, her composure unshaken. Then let us not disappoint it. If we are to confront this entity, we must do so on our terms. Poirot nodded, her expression resolute. Exactly. We will not run. We will face it. The group exchanged uneasy glances but nodded in agreement. They pressed on, the whispers guiding them deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, until they reached a small clearing bathed in an eerie silver light. In the centre of the clearing stood a figure, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and indistinct. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices echoing in the darkness. Beware the echo, it always returns. Poirot stepped forward, her lantern held high. Who are you? She demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. The figure turned, its face obscured by shadows. When it spoke, its voice was a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down their spines. I am the echo, the memory of pain, the voice of the forgotten. Eleanor, Blackwood gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It's him, the traveller, the one who cursed the woods. The figure's head tilted, its form shifting slightly. You know of me, it said, its voice filled with bitterness. But you do not understand. The woods remember. They always remember. Poirot's gaze narrowed. What do you want? The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. Justice, it said, for Constance, for the pain she endured, for the lies that buried her. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The villagers, she said slowly. They blamed her for the curse, but it was not her fault, was it? The figure's form flickered, its voice growing softer. She was innocent. They took her from me, and now the echo returns to claim what is owed. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the trees swaying violently. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they formed a single chilling phrase. Beware the echo. It always returns. Poirot stepped forward, her voice steady. We have the journal, she said. We know the truth. Let us end this. The bird figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. The truth, it whispered. Yes, the truth. As the tremors subsided, the figure began to dissolve, its form fading into the shadows. The whispers grew softer, more distant, until they were gone entirely. The clearing was silent, the air still. Poirot turned to the group, her expression thoughtful. The echo is not a curse, she said. It is a cry for justice. And now we must ensure that justice is served. Chapter 10. The echoes resolved back at Blackwood Manor. The group gathered in the drawing-room, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the restored fire. The journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with the elegant handwriting of Constance Blackwood. Hercule Poirot stood at the centre, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she prepared to reveal the truth. "The mystery of the Whispering Woods," she began, her voice calm but commanding, "is not one of curses or spirits. It is a story of love, betrayal, and the enduring power of memory." Eleanor Blackwood leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What do you mean?" Poirot picked up the journal, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "Constance Blackwood was not a victim of the woods," she said. "She was a victim of the villagers' fear and prejudice. Her love for the traveller, a man they deemed unnatural, was seen as a threat. When she refused to renounce him, they turned on her." Clara Winslow frowned. "But the legend says she died in the woods. Was it murder?" Poirot nodded. According to her journal, Constance was lured into the woods under false pretenses. The villagers confronted her, accusing her of bringing a curse upon them. In their fear and anger, they silenced her. A heavy silence fell over the room. Harold Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. And the traveller, what became of him? "He fled," Poirot said, "but not before leaving behind a warning. He carved the runes into the tree as a form of protection, not just for Constance's memory, but for anyone who might suffer a similar fate. The whispers in the woods are not a curse. They are a plea for justice." Lady Thornbury, ever composed, leaned back in her chair. "And the figure we saw in the woods, was it him?" Poirot's gaze softened. "In a sense, yes. The traveller's grief and anger became intertwined with the woods themselves, creating an echo of his pain. But it was not a malevolent force. It was a cry for the truth to be uncovered." Dr. Hartley let out a long breath, his face pale. "So, all of this, the whispers, the accident, Samuel's disappearance, it was all to lead us to the truth." "Precisely," Poirot said. "The echo sought to expose the villagers' crime and ensure that Constance's story was not forgotten." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "All these years we thought the woods were cursed, but it was never the woods. It was us." Poirot placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The past cannot be changed, but it can be acknowledged. By uncovering the truth, we have given Constance and the traveller the justice they deserve." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over the group. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but the whispers were gone. The woods were quiet, as if finally at peace. Epilogue. In the days that followed, the group worked together to share Constance's story with the village. A memorial was erected in her honour, and the runes on the ancient tree were restored. The whispers in the woods ceased, and the village began to heal. As Hercule Poirot prepared to leave Blackwood Manor, Eleanor approached her, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've given us closure." Poirot smiled softly. "The truth, Madame Blackwood, is always worth seeking, even when it is painful." With that, Poirot stepped into the waiting car, her mind already turning to the next mystery. But as the manor faded into the distance, she couldn't help but glance back at the woods one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, their secrets finally laid to rest. And so, the mystery of the Whispering Woods was resolved, its echoes fading into memory. But for Hercule Poirot, the pursuit of truth would always continue.